Hey guys, welcome to today's Vehicle Visionary. Does it look like we're in a different setting than any other video I have ever done before? Well, we definitely are. I'm in the race shop here at Imperial Construction, PJS Racing, and we're going to take a look at the race cars here. They run in the Pro Modified division in the NHRA, and we're going to talk about some interesting little features and some of the things you might not know about that go on with these cars and how some things work. And then in a separate video, you'll probably see the big 18-wheeler trailer behind me. There's actually two of them in here, and we're going to look at those in a separate video, so if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do. Now, I do want to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, findthebestcarprice.com. If you are in the process of looking for a new vehicle, or down the road you're going to be, you need to check out the link in the description of this video to the findthebestcarprice.com website. Free training is available there to teach you how to go about buying your next vehicle the same way that a professional auto broker would do so. The training shows you how to contact the dealerships through email. All the information you need to know is right there, and it basically will start a bidding war for your business between multiple dealerships. Now that we got that out of the way, let's take a look at these cars. Okay guys, normally I talk about the history of the vehicles that I review here on the Vehicle Visionary YouTube channel. So let's talk a little bit of history about the Pro Modified drag racing class. It was originally started in 1990. That was its first season in drag racing under the International Hot Rod Association. There's two different sanctioning bodies, NHRA and IHRA. And keep in mind, this was over 30 years ago. Now these cars will run the quarter mile in a little over 5.6 seconds at about 260 miles an hour. Back in 1990, in fact, the very first one I ever saw in 1991 ran 6.90 seconds at 201 miles an hour, and people went crazy because that was really fast for a car like that back then. There are multiple engine combinations. These cars run superchargers that we're going to look at today. You can also run nitrous oxide. You can also run a turbocharger. So there's a couple of different options there, and NHRA tries to get parity set up with all of that. It's an interesting balance of making sure one car doesn't have a huge advantage over another with a different engine combination. And of course, these are carbon fiber composite bodies. As you can see, these are the C7 style Corvette body on the two we're going to take a look at today. And everything is as aerodynamic and functional as possible. And I'm going to prove to everybody, hopefully, the old belief that in drag racing all you do is go in a straight line. That definitely is not the case. In fact, these cars, I think they're about 115-inch wheelbase. Remember, if you've watched me before, wheelbase being the center of the front tire to the center of the rear tire. That's how long the car is. They handle really well, but the problem is that not being any longer than that, when they do get out of shape, they get out of shape very quickly, and especially when you're running almost 260 miles an hour, some have run that, things can happen in a hurry. In fact, as the cars go down the racetrack, they run a quarter mile with these cars at most races I go to, sometimes in the 8th mile. But if you think about this, an 8th mile is 660 feet. If the car moves to the right, by the time the driver responds and the car reacts to that response, they're almost to the finish line. That's how quick these cars are going down the racetrack. And there's a lot of other variables that go into it as well, and we'll talk about that later in the video as far as what contributes to car control. Okay guys, let's talk about a very important part. Like I said, there's multiple combinations of engines you can run in the class that these cars compete in. These running the Supercharger. So here is a Supercharger. Now this is the top hat. This is where the air goes in to get to the Supercharger itself, which is this case down here. How does that work? When the driver slams the throttle down to leave the starting line, these butterflies or blades, depending on what you want to call them, are wide open just like that. That allows the air to go inside and make its way to the impellers inside of the Supercharger, a Supercharger being an air compressor basically. That's the simplest way I can explain it. And those impellers in this particular style of Supercharger turn inward towards each other and basically force the air at a high velocity into the engine. And of course that allows for burning more fuel and making more horsepower when you put the fuel, air, and spark ratio together and make all that work. But here's something very interesting. If you watch a car with one of these superchargers on it like this, do a burnout, and it just billows smoke off of the rear tires. The throttle's not wide open like this, like it would be going down the racetrack. It's open about that much. You probably can't see that real well on the screen, but I mean, and it may not even be as much as I've got it open right now, but I can't even begin to get my fingertip underneath the blade right here, this butterfly, because it takes such a small amount of throttle to boil the tires on these vehicles. Now, over the years, of course, they've come up with different technology and ways to control that, where it's not as easy to over-rev the engine on the burnout as it was decades ago. But there was a time when drivers had to control everything purely by feel and by their foot. A very different situation than what we have now. But essentially, that is a quick little tutorial on how a supercharger works. Okay guys, I want to cover some things, like I said, that you might not know about these cars. And it starts right here with the headers. These are the exhaust headers. So instead of having an exhaust pipe coming out under the rear bumper, or maybe out to the side on some of the vehicles that I've reviewed in the past, they basically have open exhaust right here, because the longer the exhaust, of course, that's going to keep the engine from being able to make as much horsepower. Now, these are very interesting. They're called zoomy headers, and you can pretty much see why that is because of their angle. And it's not just to allow the engine to make maximum horsepower, but they're also used for downforce. How exactly does that work? Well, obviously, that's one thing. Car control is so important with these cars, or any car going down the drag strip, especially the faster they go, the more they need that. And with these headers, what happens is the exhaust pressure that comes out of these headers under full acceleration actually helps to keep the car planted on the ground. In fact, if you watch a top fuel dragster or a funny car, they're more prone to do this than a car like this, although it can, but do what's called dropping a cylinder. You've got 8 cylinders here, 4 on each side. It's a V8 engine. And when it drops a cylinder, what that means is 3 of these pipes are putting that pressure out and 1 isn't. So what's going to happen is it's going to create an unequal balance, or an uneven balance, because on the other side of the car, if all 4 cylinders are firing, it's going to push the car in that direction. And that's one of the reasons why you will see these cars moving around so much. Like I said, there's multiple ways that they work to keep these cars on the ground and glued and going straight. But that's not the only secret to what does that for these race cars. Okay guys, here is one of the rear slicks off of these cars right here. As you can see, they're a very wide tire. I'll give you the dimensions on the screen of exactly what they are and show you what the tire actually says, because some of you probably won't believe me if I tell you. I know how the YouTube world works. But how exactly does this system work? Well, first of all, these are very flexible tires. Even though there's no air in here right now, you would actually call this a wrinkle wall. And so what happens is when the car goes down the racetrack, the tire is flexing and kind of bending, and if the car isn't set up just right, it can actually kind of change its size and go into what's called tire shake. If you talk to the driver, it's more driver shake than tire shake, and what that means is the car cannot get up on the contact patch. You have to have a little bit of a controlled spin when you leave the starting line to allow the tire to literally begin to grow as it goes down the racetrack. And it will go from being the size that it is here to about like that. It's really interesting to watch. You can't see it the same way on these full-bodied cars as you can on, say, a dragster. So what's going to happen, that's why the cars do the burnouts, so they can have the best opportunity at maximum traction. They put down some fresh rubber. That's why you got to back the car up in the exact tracks the car just put down on the burnout, or it's pretty much wasted. And so here's the interesting thing. It has to have that little bit of a controlled spin to leave the starting line. That's why you'll often see, if you've seen a slow-mo of these, leaving the starting line, you'll see the wrinkles in the bottom of the tire. If you were to guess how much air pressure goes in a tire like this when the car goes down the racetrack, if you don't already know, you would probably guess way too high. 4.5 to about 6 pounds is typical. I don't know what these guys normally run. It depends on track conditions and a lot of different variables, but that is what happens. And what you see, this ring right here, that's called a bead lock. That's basically meant to keep the car, which has so much horsepower, 2,500 to 3,000 horsepower roughly, somewhere in that range, maybe a little bit less than 2,500, but that's where it is roughly. It could actually spin the tire off of the rim if not for this bead lock right here. One of the very interesting things that's used to help this car to go down the racetrack. But let me show you something else that also contributes to how the car goes and which direction it leaves in when it takes off from the starting line. Okay guys, let's talk about the wheelie bars back here. And the first thing you're going to think is, well, that's meant to keep the car from going over backwards, right? Or lifting the front end up too high. Well, that's true, but there's also adjustments that are actually made. If you look at these from the back, you'll notice sometimes that they're not even with each other, and that's intentional. Depending on how the car is going to leave the starting line, it actually can be used to help control the direction the car goes in. Of course, you've also got the parachutes back here. You can see that on the other car. They're packed up. They're not in their packs here on this particular car. But there's also one other thing back here that I want to show you. An interesting little bit of safety, and there is a lot of safety features built into these cars, but one thing that you might not have ever known about. In the event of a crash, the very first person on scene comes and finds the safety cutoff switch. In this case, it's something that you actually would push in, kind of a button of sorts. But what happens is they come on scene and they push that, and it kills all of the power to the car. So that turns off the fuel pumps, the oil pump, everything, and obviously will help lessen the issue of any potential danger after an incident. Something I've never done before, shown a transmission. It's a lot easier to do here in this particular setting because they've got all the spare parts and everything sitting inside their trailers and all. So when they go to the races, if something breaks or they want to change something out, well, it's pretty easy to get inside here and pull out what you need. In this case, it's a 3-speed transmission. This is actually a 5-speed is what it is, and they block off the other 2 gears because they're only allowed to use 3 gears with the supercharged setup in the NHRA rules for Pro Modified. And depending on what your setup is, turbocharged, supercharged, or carbureted with nitrous oxide, well, determines a lot of different things. We won't go into that. But here's what you have here. This is the reverser right here. Everything is controlled by CO2, just like those launchers on the parachutes. It's air shifted. Now, something that's changed from what it used to be, like I said earlier, I think I might have mentioned in the video, or I don't know if I said it or not, but in the early days of Pro Modified, the drivers shifted the cars by hand, okay? It's basically a different style of transmission than what it used to be. They had clutches back then, and here's the thing, they'd leave the starting line and let go of the clutch. The transmission was called clutchless. That's not what this is. It's more of an automatic style of sorts because it's air shifted, so it operates like an automatic. The driver still shifts it himself, but it's kind of like putting your Mercedes-Benz AMG into Sport or Sport Plus mode and using the paddle shifters or whatever your vehicle is. So kind of the same process there as you have here. But now the drivers are having to manually shift these cars. But on the older style with the clutchless transmissions, notice I said they let go of the clutch when they left the starting line. The reason it was called clutchless is because to change gears, they didn't have to shove the clutch in like you would on your street car. Okay guys, now that I'm sitting in the car, let's talk a little bit about what goes on when it's going down the racetrack and how the driver actually does everything. There is a shifter right here that they're putting in, so kind of a different system here, more of just pushing a button and changing gears that way. Something new for 2021, I believe, for the NHRA Pro Mod guys. It used to be that you could air shift the transmission and the driver didn't have to do anything. Previously, the transmission was shifted via this red button on the steering wheel. You also have a trans brake here to build brake pressure to help get the car as far as leaving the starting line and all that good stuff. What that does is it essentially locks the transmission up and the car stays in place. It's kind of like using launch mode on some of the higher end vehicles that are out there, whatever you may think of. So essentially, that's what's happening when you hold the brake and mat the gas and let go of the brake, except in this case, they're just using a button. And of course, they still do the same thing here where the pedal is on the floor and they let go of that button and go on down the racetrack. And like I said, you shift it twice since it's a 3-speed transmission, and it was, again, through this red button on the steering wheel right here, but they're changing things over for the next race. They're going to this system here. And of course, here's the transmission right here. You're just going to reach up there like I showed you in the trailer with that transmission that was on the workbench. That's how you just pull that back and get it into reverse. Pretty simple system here. Now on the front of the steering wheel, there is a release right here that says fire. It does have onboard fire extinguishers. It also has an onboard oxygen system. Let's see if I don't even know if I can reach the line from right here. But the driver actually has air plugged into his helmet. So there's a lot going on here. There's a CO2 canister. If you're wondering about how these cars start, I'm going to show you that with the Supercharger we looked at earlier. They prime the engine through that injector we looked at earlier. So they're going to squirt some fuel in there, and then the driver will go ahead and turn everything on, the fuel pumps and all that stuff, and all that is activated right here via some switches on a panel right up here. And what will happen is, the reason they prime that is because the engine has to suck the fuel up through the lines to the fuel pump before the engine actually can run on that fuel pump. And if you've ever wondered about that, sometimes you'll hear the starter running for a really long time. It's bringing that fuel up, and of course they use that prime to help get that initial burst to get it started. And one last thing here, and you're going to see this different in different cars, but in this particular model, there's a lever right here. The driver is going down the racetrack. You'll see, if you ever seen an in-car shot, they reach up here, push that lever forward, that releases those parachutes in the back. Some people have a button on the steering wheel for that, maybe somewhere else inside the car. But as you can see, it's a really tight fit in here. You've got a harness system here that keeps the driver nice and tight in the car with the fire suit and the helmet and everything on. It's even tighter than where I'm sitting, the way I'm sitting right now, because I don't have all that on. And if you've ever wondered why I tend to sit the way I do in the cars you see me test drive, sometimes from the right angle, I'm kind of close to the steering wheel. This is why, because of my racing background. I'm used to that. I don't like to have my arms way out because it just makes me feel like I have more control of the car that way. I don't feel like I'm as much in control if my arms are further out. It has a digital dashboard, which isn't on right now, but kind of similar to what a lot of the high-end cars have, I guess you could say, in a way. So it doesn't have analog gauges like old school race cars would. And also up here on the dashboard, it kind of looks like a gun sight almost. That is a shift light, so the driver knows that information is pre-programmed through the onboard computer system to basically let that light flash. It tells the driver when to shift to second, when to shift to third, and then of course after that, that's when he reaches up, grabs the parachute lever, gets ready to shut the car off and do all that kind of stuff. Like I talked about earlier, this drag racing stuff is not as easy as many assume it to be. Okay guys, real quick, hey, let me take the towel off of the engine so you can see what's here. I just wanted to show you real quick. Of course, this is the blower belt. That's what turns the supercharger. It actually turns off of the crankshaft, so that's how that supercharger actually turns. Here's a look at the engine that's in this particular car. Pretty high-end, pretty cool stuff, all aluminum. There's a lot to that. In fact, an interesting note on that. The driver, the team will set the valves, they'll warm the car up, reset the valves, get everything correct before they take it to the starting line. And even though this car doesn't take the maintenance that, say, a top fuel dragster or a funny car does, they don't always tear the engine down to the bare block between rounds. There can be situations where that might happen, but they do quite a bit of maintenance anyway. But just even after that, just to get the car warmed up, it's surprising what all goes into that, including that process of setting and resetting, checking the valves multiple times so that everything's just right. And let me move the towel out of the way. This is the fuel tank right here. This is obviously not necessary to have a 20 or 30 gallon tank or something like you would have on your street car, because they're only on the track from the time they start the car until the time the parachutes open. I would say is about a minute and a half, maybe something like that. And that is a tour of a pro modified drag racing car, at least a supercharged version. And let me know in the comments, guys, or contact me through email. For those of you other racers out there who might say, hey Tom, I want you to come and review my race car, tell people about it, because all of these cars are different. There are multiple classes within the sport of drag racing. By no means is Pro Modified the only class. There's a lot out there. So if you want to do something, let me know. We'll see what we can do. I got to say a special thanks to Jeff here at PJS Racing for being kind enough. I contacted him 2 days ago about doing this, and he just basically said, hey, we're leaving for a race on Thursday. Come anytime between now and then. So thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Dollar and all the other guys here at the shop that were kind enough to help out with getting everything in place for me, unloading the transmission and all that stuff. And of course, most importantly, I appreciate each and every one of you who were kind enough to watch today's video. Tell me if you want to see more of this kind of stuff. Say it in the comments, and the right people can see that, and that might give us an opportunity to look at a lot more racing operations like this. And I'll tell you what, I could get used to doing this in late April in Dallas, Texas, well, in the Dallas area. I'm actually in Weatherford today, and it's nice and cool inside of this air-conditioned shop. Man, I'd like to do that more often. Thanks for watching, guys. Well, this ought to be a good blooper watching me get out of the car. Ugh.